This is I Hear Things for Friday, September 24th, 2021, Podcasting for Connection. Today I'm going to dive into a thing that you can podcast about, even if you don't know what to podcast about. And it's a way to practice your craft off stage. And that's a thing I've talked about before. I'm also going to give away an idea, just flat out give it away, that could make you a thousandaire, not a millionaire. But first we have to take a detour, and you should know I'm a terrible driver. I've been thinking a lot about Facebook recently, and I've mentioned in this space before that Facebook's move to add podcasts natively to everyone's feed is an enormous opportunity to grow your audience with people who may not be interested in podcasts per se or the media, but they might actually like your stuff if they encounter it. And I still believe this. Nothing has changed there factually. It's good business advice. But admittedly, it makes me a little queasy. And I think many of you may have seen the series of articles put out by the Wall Street Journal this week called the Facebook Files that details some of what goes on under the hood at Facebook. And I don't think it's surprising to a lot of us, but maybe the extent of it has surprised some of you. Every day I see falsehoods and mistruths peddled on Facebook by people I know, people I have known, even people I'm related to. Facebook, I think we're coming to see, is capable of doing enormous harm to both our mental health, but also to the fabric of society. And I think that's what Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, I think that's what he was talking about earlier this week on CNBC. He told Jim Cramer, at some point, somebody is going to say, wow, this is the source of a lot of these problems. You look at what's going on in the pandemic and the amount of information that's just plain wrong that's on there. This has to stop. By now, I think each of us probably knows someone who has deleted their Facebook account. And for most of them, their reasons were intensely personal and related to mental health. Teddy Roosevelt famously said, comparison is the thief of joy. And social media, Facebook in particular, but Instagram too, all of them, they've stolen a lot of joy from people over the years. At Edison, we've done a ton of research on social media over the last decade or so, and the science is there. It's inarguable, really. Whether or not social media can be shown to have degraded our society, it's a moot point. I think we will begin to see that more and more. But it can be shown to have degraded our psyches, and it's been doing that for years. We released a study earlier this year called Twitter Before and After Trump. I'll link to it in the show notes. And in that study, we looked at people's perceptions and usage of social media before and after Donald Trump and thousands of other accounts were banned on Twitter for spreading misinformation. Most of the report was about the consequences for Twitter, but the second half of the report really talked about all the platforms. And buried in that report were a few gems, and here's one of them. And again, I will link to this graph in the show notes for those of you that cannot see what I'm thinking. But we published a graph where we asked people a variety of questions about things that they had encountered on social media in the last year in using social media. Have you ever seen a news story that you believe had misleading or invented information? And we split this out by people who are politically liberal and politically conservative. And the answer is that both liberals and conservatives have all encountered these things in nearly equal measures. Misleading information, around half have been offended by videos, images, or stories. Around 40% of each group felt judged or criticized for their personal opinions. Others have been called offensive names. Others have felt discriminated or harassed because of their race. Now, sometimes data like this washes over us and it fails to register. But if you take that data and you replace the word social media with laundry detergent or motor oil or quiescently frozen ice cream novelties, you'd have a different picture, right? Would you keep buying Skinny Cow ice cream sandwiches if they made you feel judged all the time? Only if you like being judged, I guess. Or you just couldn't quit Skinny Cow. The thing is, like smoking cigarettes, I think we all know that Facebook and its ilk are doing us harm. Back in 2019, we published a study called Unfriending Facebook. And this was in response to some data we had collected that about 15 million people had departed the service in the period of time between 2017 and 2019. We could see that people were starting to leave Facebook in droves, And even for those who weren't leaving, they were spending less time on the platform because they perceived Facebook as a place for negativity, misinformation, and a violation of their privacy. But we still use Facebook. I use Facebook. I use Facebook every single day. And my reason is the same as we had a respondent in the qualitative portion of that project, 25-year-old Jennifer, and she gave this reason. I don't want to miss something, be it what something wore or an event they went to or something interesting. Well, Jennifer, age 25, I agree. I feel the same way. The pandemic has made this worse by constraining our social lives largely within the corral of our social media lives. And this is unsatisfying, even to an introvert like I am. Some of you may know that Edison, my company, besides providing the podcast industry with credible metrics for the last 15 years, has also been the sole provider of exit polling data to the news networks for even longer, since 2003. And we also provide the reporting of vote count data that we all eagerly watch for on important election days. If you're watching election coverage on TV, you're seeing our data. And as such, I am steeped in politics through and through. I love to talk politics. I cannot talk politics on social media. Cannot. First of all, I'm constrained by a legal document that I have with my company that I refrain from partisan commentary on social media, and that's because our election work really is a sacred trust. We treat it that way. There can't be any doubt in the public eye that we don't take our charge very seriously. We take it very seriously indeed. But also, I just can't, as in, I just can't even. Not talking about politics on social media has been objectively better for my sanity. I go out of my way to avoid those conversations on social media. I'm reminded about this quote. This is a quote about Facebook and the weak ties that it helps us to maintain by the late science fiction author Philip K. Dick. And he wrote, "Maybe it's as real as our world. Maybe we cannot say that we are in touch with reality, and he is not, but should instead say his reality is so different from ours that he can't explain his to us, and we can't explain ours to him. My problem, then, is that if subjective worlds are experienced too differently, there occurs a breakdown in communication, and there is the real illness." Now, actually, this quote was about, let me check my notes here. It was about schizophrenia, not Facebook. But it still works. I avoid talking politics on social media because my subjective world, and the subjective world of many of my friends and family, seems to be growing further and further apart all the time. And it's enervating, and it's enraging, and it's sad all at the same time. But I scrolled my Facebook feed today. I did it anyway. I did so because most of the ties in my life are weak ties. This is true if you're an adult, by the way. Of course it is. Most of the ties in my life are weak ties, and most of those weak ties are tended to on Facebook. To quit Facebook would be to snip hundreds of the weak threads that hold up my net. No single thread matters all that much, but if you snip them all at once, the trapeze act is over. It struck me as I was thinking about all this that podcasting might be one of the answers here. It's not the answer, but it could help. And I'm not talking about the intimate nature of listening to a podcast like This American Life. Yes, I said intimate, so you can drink or yell bingo or whatever. And yeah, there is an intimate nature to listening to This American Life. But Ira doesn't know you, and you don't know Ira. I'm talking about genuine connection with the people you already know and love in your life that takes place asynchronously, at scale, and in private. I had an idea a while back for something that I called in my head Family Cast. My idea was to create a platform where people could create podcasts or just audio messages that were designed to be heard only by their friends and family, and to have a kind of family directory where a small invited group could share audio files to keep in touch with each other without having to worry about Facebook or anyone else profiting from our data or our souls. And really, it's sort of like voicemail, but for multiple people. It's a group chat voicemail, right? Velvet rope, private community, whatever. I was thinking about this. I have a really good friend, Melissa, that I almost never talk to. Hi, Melissa, if you're listening. There always seems to be something that interrupts that call we were going to have or that get-together we had planned. It's on both of us. It's life. But there's no reason why I couldn't sit down right now and record a Melissa cast. I'm not sure that that's going to be a big seller on Apple Podcasts or on the charts, but I could do it. I could do something for her, or I could do something designed only for an invited group to hear, that group of high school friends that I played fantasy baseball with, or that group of college friends, or whatever. Now, there's nothing new to this idea, really. We've had private podcasting for years, although generally it's been positioned as something corporate. It's just a new skin on this idea to replace the benefit statement of now you can podcast privately to now you can stay closer to your family and friends. Now, that's a much better mission statement. Anyway, it's less of a standalone idea than, I think, a feature for some of the podcast hosts to consider mocking up. But hey, if you think it's a business, have at it. You could become a thousandaire. I'd use it. It would also, he says selfishly, be a great way to get some reps as a podcaster. Writers get to make draft after draft. It's the only way to get better. But draft after draft, it's just not as practical for the podcaster as it is for the writer. It's very time consuming. Creating a quick podcast for friends and family and encouraging them to do the same, it's a way to get those reps in, discover your voice, and make some art in its own way without being on stage. As a writer, I've seen, heard of, and even purchased hundreds of aids to writer's block. Most of these consist of various questions and prompters to get you writing something, anything, because the motion of the pen unblocks the flow of the words. There's a magic in that. You have a story in you. You have more than one, I'd wager. And maybe you don't think that story would be very interesting to me or to a larger audience or even to all of your Facebook friends. Maybe it would only really be interesting to that one group of 3 or 4 college friends with whom you shared a particular inside joke. Well, make them a podcast. There's nothing stopping you. I wrote this for myself because when I sat down this week to think about my newsletter and this podcast, I didn't have a topic. I had a little writer's block or podcaster's block or whatever you want to call it. We all get it. But remove the obligation of the public stage from your thinking, and that block kind of magically disappears. What would you do with your podcast if it didn't matter? What would you podcast if the audience was just your first boss? What would you podcast if your audience was your ex-wife or ex-husband or your butcher? Make that podcast. You might find the seeds for a larger story that's been eluding you, but there is still satisfaction and connection in even the smallest story. And maybe, just maybe, if you send that podcast to friends and family, maybe you'll get one back. And I wonder if more of us had this in our lives, if Facebook could survive. I'm Tom Webster. Thanks for listening to I Hear Things, and we'll see you next week.